Thank you, everybody, for being here. It's very nice after 5 years of being researching these small bassoons that we can finally have a symposium here at home and explain all these things and share all this knowledge with you. So thank you for coming, and also thank you to the people who are watching from home. So when we started this project, we found around 20 instruments, more or less. Right now, we have already located more than 130 instruments. These are instruments that have survived. That means that at the time they were built many, many, many more. So this means that these instruments were not anecdotic. They were not only some kind of trial or thing that the maker was trying to achieve just as a show. And also the first hypothesis that we had, that they were built for children, is a little bit doubtful, because many of the instruments that we have found, they are built in special woods and in a very, very luxurious and dedicated manner. So what I'm going to present today is all different kind of small bassoons that we have encountered. And I'm going to try to draw some kind of map of when these instruments were built, in which regions, at what time, and with this giving some kind of hints on the history of these small bassoons, because they do have their own history that comes in parallel with the full-size bassoon, but they have their own history. So one of the reasons perhaps why these small instruments were forgotten in time is because it's not a very clear way of naming them. Nowadays, everybody is familiar with the term Fagottino because they are used in modern pedagogy. But if we look at the sources, there is not a common term at all. Here I've created a small map of all the words that we can find referring to the Fagottino. Among those, we include piccolo fagotto, hochsect fagot, soprano, quint fagot, high bassoon, basson d'amore, basson à la goutte. Many, many, many ways of calling these instruments. If we look at the sources, then we see that at the end, the dictionaries or in the methods, the people who were referring to these instruments, they just gave a description, so it became clear what they were talking about. It was like a small bassoon, that it was tuned in this pitch or another pitch. But if we are looking only at the term, how they were calling, is really, really complicated. So what types of bassoons we find? I've made this diagram so we have a clear idea of which instruments, with a bottle of champagne, so everybody knows more or less the reference we are talking about here. So the larger instrument down there is a contrabassoon, an instrument that is tuned 1 octave lower than the full-size bassoon, or the normal bassoon. The so-called normal bassoon, the full-size bassoon, will be like the second from the top. That's an instrument tuned in C, and the one that we are all familiar with. The next instrument is an instrument tuned in F. The one above is an instrument tuned in G, and then the smaller one is an octave instrument tuned in C. Those are the instruments that we have found across, and those 130 instruments, they are in those categories. There are also, like James Cobb was talking about, there are some references about instruments in E-flat, but we haven't really found any real instrument, only some written reference, so it's very unclear if they were built or how or what really happened. So these are the instruments that we have found. In general, we have agreed with the team that we are using the word Fagottino as a generic word to refer to any kind of small instrument, but also more specifically, Fagottino is the tenor, the small one that you see there, and then the transposition instruments in G and F are the tenor instruments, the ones that we call tenoroons. That's an agreement that we came up at the beginning because it was not clear at all, so we have to establish some grounds, so how to call them. So where were these instruments made and by whom? This is a map from all of the important makers that were making small bassoons in the 18th and 19th centuries. Here you can see very important names that they were building with instruments in general, bassoons, like Denner, Grenser, Kraus, in Germany, Tauber, Stelle in Austria, Adler, Deleuze in France, Caussac, Milot in United Kingdom, among others. But as you can see, all the instruments, they were being built all over Europe, and most of the most famous makers of this 18th and 19th century, they were paying attention to the instruments. So again, this is not an anecdotic instrument or something that one maker will think like, why? So taking into account the 130 instruments that we have found and all the reference and bibliography, I've made some division in different small periods to try to understand a little bit better when those instruments were built and how. Because not all the instruments were built at the same time, and also the different types, the different sizes of instruments that I was talking about before, they were not all at the same time being built. So I made the division, and the first early period, so to speak, will be between 1680 and 1780. There are around 30 surviving instruments from this area. I made some color coding, so you see every dot, every shadow that you see is one instrument that has survived, so we know more or less where they are. The orange ones, they represent Fagottino, so tenor instruments, small instruments tuned in C. Green ones are tenoroons in F, tenoroons in G are blue, and something that we don't really know because we haven't examined or anything, will be some kind of shadow color. In any case, as we see in this very early period, most of the instruments, they come from the German area, some of them also in Paris, but mostly German area, and there are instruments, they are Fagottino, there are instruments tuned in C, one octave higher. Some small instruments tuned in G also, they are also there, but most of the instruments are like that. Some examples of these instruments are, I've selected these ones. Most of these instruments, they are more or less like the instruments in the bassoon family. They have 3 or 4 keys, as is typical from instruments from this period, and depending on the region they come from, they have different, well, they are copying, they are more or less similar, mirroring the same kind of instruments as before. The Scherer and the Kraus that I've put there, I've selected there, they are very important because they represent a very good example of how these big wind music houses and instrument makers were really working in the 18th century. They correspond to big families. There is not only one Scherer or one Kraus, there are many, the son was taking over. It was really a workshop where many people were employed. From these small instruments, the Scherer, we have already collected around 5 or 6 instruments, and the Kraus also something like that. So they are the most numerous instruments and therefore the most important ones. And the Denner and the Rothenburg that you see there are probably one of the most early small bassoon that we see here. But we have found so many instruments, there are not many references in written sources, and the questions arise of what are these instruments being used for? So it's not very clear, it's not 100% clear. One of the reasons because they are not written in the score that is specifically for Fagottino. We only have a few cases of these things. So after examining many amount of music and scores, we came to the conclusion that these small instruments that they were there, so they were played somehow, and most of them they have signs of being played. They were used in cantatas or sacred music. We also find some reference where they're explicitly asking for a Fagottino, for a small instrument, in some opera arias. So in some arias they were looking for a special color, so they were really looking for Fagottino. And in many places we also think that they were being used as a substitute of some voices like viola. We think that because very often the part of the bassoon changes the key, or it's written viola and bassoon together, so it's very likely that the maker, the player, had a small bassoon close to them and they just switched instruments. So going on with the instruments, we come here to what I call the golden age of the Fagottino, between 1780 and 1810. The turn of the 19th century is a key century in the bassoon building, not only the small ones, but also the larger instruments. Many of the changes that came from what we now consider Baroque to classical appear in this period, and the bassoon has its own voice and starts to have its own character. And all this is reflected in the small instruments. That's why it's not a surprise that we are starting to find more and more instruments from this period. Now the center is not anymore in Germany. We also see that Paris is very, very prominent. Still, many of the instruments are still in C, but we also find some instruments tuned in G. I've chosen some few examples from this period and from different places. We see some Grenser, that is this one, the contrast, it's so different because the keys are made out of ivory, which is one more idea that these instruments, they were really a luxurious item, not necessarily something. And then we have English instruments with the English characteristic, like this Kautsak. All these small instruments, even if they were small, they were following all these characteristics that they have, the larger instruments. And we have the Porto. And this Porto that is now in the Paris Conservatory Museum, Musée de la Musique, is we've dated in around 1808. Because if you remember now in the conference that James Cobb was giving, he was talking about this dispute between Savary and Porto, and this letter where Porto is claiming, no, I have invented a new instrument for which, that I call tenor, for which I've made a wooden bassoon. Wooden vocal. The wooden vocal didn't appear anyway. So it's very likely that this instrument is the one that he's referring in that thing. Because when examining it close, we can see that it's a prototype, the holes are built in different places, and also this instrument is an instrument in tune in F, because it's slightly larger than all the tenor instruments that we have found so far. And perhaps one day we find more instruments tuned in F who are earlier, but it's very likely that this is the first instrument tuned in F, and this is the invention, the new tenor, and that's what Porto was really meaning in his letter, because everybody knew at that time that there were already instruments tuned in G. So tenor instrument cannot be really an invention, but an instrument in tune in F, it can start being an invention. So moving on, we come to a period between 1810 and 1850, where we see a very different different way of building the instruments. Now we see that majority of the instruments are instruments tuned in F, which is more comfortable probably and is more relevant in the uses, as I will explain later. Paris becomes a very important capital of these instruments, and many instruments are built there from all the major makers. Savary, as James Cobb was talking before, is one important reference. We have around 14 instruments that have survived of different sizes made by him, but also Vienna is a very, very important place where many makers were making these instruments, most of them tuned in F, some of them also in G. And also in Germany there were still important names making instruments like Grenser, and in London as well. So this is really a period where most of the instruments that have survived were built. The instrument I have chosen here to show is the first one is the Savary from 1927 that James Cobb was talking again. All this kind of very complex way of placing the keys is really, really something to notice. In Germany, this Grenser Wiesner means that they were also building these major factories. They were really, really making instruments. We also have one Swiss example, probably used in military music, because his power was really a very important maker for military music, and we have already 2 instruments that have survived in Switzerland. And of course, we have some instruments from Vienna, like this Kurs that is here. And notice that, as I was saying before, that all these instruments, they follow all the characteristics, construction characteristics that the instruments, the big instruments were at that time. For instance, in these instruments from Vienna, the keys are carved inside of the wood, like in the larger instruments from that region. They are very, very typical, which again leads to think if somebody goes so much trouble to place the keys in such a detailed manner, is like these instruments were not only used for kids, but also in many different settings. And again, the question, what are the instruments, what were they used for? So in the 19th century, also the bassoon has a different role as it had in the 18th century. In the 18th century, the bassoon was a basso continuo, apart from the different roles that they have, and from the turn of the century, it became more solistic. And here, this is also reflected in the Fagottino. Again, we don't have a lot of reference and a lot of music that explicitly call for a tenoroon, a Fagottino, or something. We have some examples, though, like this American march that calls for a tenoroon, which is one of the few references that we find from some American score. Is military music completely. Or we have the Frost that we'll hear it tonight. That is a harmony music piece, so the instrument was used in military music. The instrument was also used as a virtuoso instrument. We don't really have many music scores, but we have a few references in newspapers that they claim so, that they announce a concert by Jancourt, for instance, who is playing his tenor bassoon in this salle in Paris, blah, blah, blah. And we also have a few references, like James Cook was mentioning before, about the tenor instrument being a substitute of the English horn, especially in the orchestra in Bordeaux. This makes a lot of sense because these instruments, most of the instruments from this period are tuned in F, as the English horn is, so it will be very, very easy to switch. But the role of these small instruments as a virtuoso, we still have many things to explore there, but it's very likely that most of these instruments that we use just to expand and to really surprise the public. And then we come to the middle of the 19th century. And in the second half of the 19th century is completely opposite of as what happened in the first half of the 19th century when so many instruments were built. Now, it's very rare. We find only in the major cities some examples that were built in the second half of the 19th century, like Paris, Vienna, or London, and very, very anecdotic. In some cases, like for instance, the last one over there, the Tribet Marsoli, is applying the new BEM system to the bassoon. So the instruments built in this period, they can be considered to be maybe experiments, or the makers were trying to make experiments more into a scientific way, or maybe to present them into exhibitions. There are not so many instruments that have survived to really, so where we can really, really say that they were played so much as they were just a few years before. We still have a few instruments from the major cities, as I was saying before. And when we were making the catalog, we put an end in 1915, in the First World War, because most of the instruments in the second half of the 19th century, there were almost no instruments, and we could really see a decline, like from the beginning to the end, so we stopped it there. And between 1915 until 1990, there was almost no references at all about the small instruments, about tenoroons. In some museums, we have some examples that they were still exhibit, and there are a few articles, maybe I can count them with my hand, I mean, making some kind of reference of these small instruments, but they were not really built, they really, really were forgotten. In the big houses like Heckel or buffet or so on. At the beginning of the 20th century, yes, they are included in references, but then they were forgotten. Maybe, perhaps this is because at this time, in the second half of the 19th century, is when the main French bassoon and German bassoon schools of building were really established, and that didn't really give space to more types of instruments, but it's just a hypothesis. The thing is that in 1990, we saw a revolution. We saw something completely different, and the Fagottino was reborn. In 1989, there was a conference, IDRS, International Double Society, held in Manchester, with Klaus Humann was there. And several small instruments were present there, originals in most of the case. Waterhouse was hosting the conference, he had a few Savarys, and in that conference they had a concert, where I have here the program with the names, Humann was playing, and they were playing also the same piece that we are going to perform tonight, the Frost Partia, that is probably it should be one of the most emblematic because it congregates several small instruments. It has two fagottinos, two tenoroons, two bassoons, and two horns. And after this conference, there was a lot of talk, and the idea of rebuilding the instrument with pedagogic perspective arose there. So several makers start making the instrument again, but thinking all the time to simplify the modern bassoon and making it smaller, so small kids, small people, children, could start playing and learn the bassoon even with smaller hands. Wolf was probably one of the first ones starting to build these instruments, but the major houses also, Fox in the States, Musman, and so on. And then, since the 90s, this transformed into a boom in the pedagogic uses. But thinking completely into how to give a new pedagogic perspective to kids, not taking so much into account of the history of these instruments. And this leads us to today, because with our team, we've been researching and taking all the ideas from this historical perspective that was forgotten until now. And we are also going to give, as my colleague Leticia will talk tomorrow, also try to give some kind of pedagogic perspective as it happened with the modern bassoon. So, thank you very much. This is a little story about the history of the instruments when they were built, and we can see that there was a curve. And we'll see more instruments these days. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Áurea, for this nice overview over all the different forms of smaller bassoons in past and present. Do you have specific questions to Áurea about that? Yeah, Martina Papiero.
So, thank you very much. Just a curiosity, I noticed that on the map you showed us, there were very blank spaces. One was Spain, and the other was central Italy. And I just wondered, is it just that there are no preserved instruments from this region, or that you just based your survey on extant instruments? Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question. About Spain, yes, I've been wondering a lot. I made this map thinking about doesn't matter the year, about the instruments that we have collected and they have survived. So I only placed a dot in instruments that have survived. In Spain, we haven't found any instrument that was made in Spain. There is only one surviving instrument, but it's a buffet, very late buffet from the late 19th century, but we haven't found that. I don't know, I can only speculate. The dulcian was in Spain very important. It was used even until the late 19th century. Of course, it was only used in church, and these instruments, the bassoons, they were used in more orchestral music. So perhaps that's a reason. Perhaps they were not building instruments in Spain, but they were like importing them from France or from Vienna, because the commerce in the 18th, 19th century was in those cities like that. But yes, I've searched. We haven't found any instrument in Spain.
Hello, Áurea. I have a question. I see the map, which is really nice, but I still have a question about what are the reasons for the makers to start on Fagottini in C, which were mostly the beginning. What drives to the makers to do it in F or in G? I mean, there is a building construction reason. There is purely musical, to be able to match easier with your colleagues in orchestra. Did you find out why they take those directions?
Thank you, Adrian. That's an interesting question. Something that I would like also to say, because I really went a little bit fast, is that the dulcian and the bassoon, in this sense, they work very different, because the dulcians, they were built in consorts from the beginning, so you have the whole family from the beginning. The small bassoons didn't really work like that. That's why you have, in different periods, they were built in different sizes, but they were not thinking, oh, these instruments are going to play together. No, they have really different roles. So they started with the small instruments tuned 1 octave, I imagine, because it was probably the most easy thing to do, just to shrink the proportions in half. And then, because these instruments, they were very often used as reinforce or doubling other instruments, like maybe the viola, maybe this later the English horn, but different parts. Perhaps all this, the idea of building these instruments tuned in G or in F, they had this perspective, thinking, well, it would be more easy to build one instrument maybe in G, and that can take the viola, clarinet space in the score. Then clearly the instruments in F, it was very clear, well, of course used in military music, but taking the place of the English horn and many instruments that they were tuning in F. So I think behind the maker's mind, it was more or less that kind of idea, and that's why they came with these instruments and these things or that. And the E-flat instruments, that is a question mark, because we haven't found instruments, but there are only a couple of references. Perhaps has also to do with that, because in band music, like we see with the saxophones, for instance, there is like a family of saxophones tuned in E-flat, or family of saxophone tuned in B-flat. So perhaps they were trying to make something that could match and play together with these instruments tuned in E-flat, or something like that. So it was probably coming out from these necessities of trying to repeat or build, fill the gaps, so to speak.
Okay, thank you, Áurea. A question perhaps also to the team. What is your first instrument you have now in your collection of Fagottini and tenoroons? I saw the Zidana, but you dated this with around 1700, and I would put it 30 years later, at least. But what is your first instrument? Because you showed us the use of Fagottini in the 1720s, or perhaps a little bit earlier.
Yes, we have the tenor, not because the instrument itself, that probably you're right. I mean, I learned from you that you should, as a museum curator, you should date all the instruments later than whoever gave you the instruments claims it is. But when we made this map of makers, we took into account the Langwell book and when these instrument makers were building their instruments, were active. So I must say the tenor, because this is the instrument that has survived, but who knows if he builds some other instruments or Gwen or something, and because it's from the makers that we have, is the maker that start building instruments the earliest, that's why we have established, that's the logic behind it.
Then I would say again thanks to Áurea for this comprehensive picture of small bassoons.